Welcome to this replay of one of the sessions from the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows 2022 Summit, Foresight Now, Harness the Future. We would like to thank our gold sponsors, Aurora WDC, Crayon, and Tyson Hines for their support. We would also like to thank our executive sponsors, the Business Intelligence Source, Commentelli, and Knowledge Inform. Please enjoy this session replay.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning, and even good evening, irrespective of where you join us in the world today. So thank you very much indeed for joining. My name is Andrew Bershkens. As August alluded to at the start, I, like him, am a CI fellow by night. I'm also a senior market insight manager at Avast by day, the third largest by global revenue at least, over-the-top digital cyber safety brand, allowing consumers to enjoy their best and most trusted digital lives online. Before we get into understanding not only today and tomorrow the problems and discussing the solutions with the how, the what, the why, and when of foresight, it gives me great pleasure to kick off proceedings by introducing our keynote speaker today, Sam Gilbert, author of the book Good Data, An Optimist Guide to Our Digital Future. I'm really looking forward to Sam kicking off proceeding as he addresses the very essence of foresight, an alternative perspective and story associated with the role of data. You, me, us, we the consumer have become perhaps the product given business models of some of big tech's brands and more than others. How big tech's platforms, algorithms are, can or could have serious consequences for society at large, a debate typically focused on risk. So anyway, sit back, pop your questions in the chat, preferably in the stage column, and we'll address those towards the end of Sam's final address, and enjoy the kind sponsorship of Aurora, Crayon, Tyson Hines, Commentelli, Knowledge Inform, and the Business Intelligence Source, who bring us Sam Gilbert, an optimist guide to our digital future. Over to you, Sam, and thank you.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for inviting me to be with you here today at the start of what seems like it's going to be a fantastic couple of days of discussion. I do have some slides to share with you, so hopefully those are now up on the screen in front of you. My talk today is entitled An Optimist's Guide to Our Digital Future, but in some ways that's a little bit ironic because we live in times that are actually rather pessimistic when it comes to the issues of data and digital technology. So I think particularly since the Cambridge Analytica scandal broke in 2018, there's been a lot of concern about the role of data in society. And many people are now worried about the ways that data and technology is used to do things like target advertising through digital platforms like Facebook, and that this could pose a threat to democratic institutions, perhaps even to fundamental human freedoms. And you might recognize that image on the screen if you have watched Netflix recently and seen their film, The Social Dilemma. And that film, I think, contains the archetypal image of how most people think about the role of data in society right now, which is the image of the control room. And in The Social Dilemma, what we see is employees of big tech companies directly controlling and manipulating individuals in a way that serves their own commercial interests. And that is, I guess, the evidence that this idea that risks are the most important thing when it comes to data and technology has really made its way into like mainstream discourse. So what do those risks include? They include things like the threat to individual privacy rights. They include the way that biases can become embedded in algorithmic decision making. And I think these are very important issues that all of us should take seriously, but crucially, they aren't the whole story. So I wrote my book, good data because I wanted to rediscover and to celebrate all of the positive ways in which data contributes to society, and to talk about the enormous potential that I see in data and digital technology as a way in which life can become better for everybody. So what I would like to do over the course of the next half an hour or so is bring to life what that might mean in practice, by putting to you and trying to persuade you of two somewhat contrarian propositions. So the first of those is that data-driven ads, which have become so controversial, are actually a good business model for the web. And secondly, that we, all of us, should embrace the idea of putting more of our data rather than less of our data into the public domain. So let's get into the first one of those. So I already mentioned in my opening remarks Cambridge Analytica and some of the concerns that are widely held about micro-targeting. And I think the presumption of many prominent critics of technology companies, including people like Shoshana Zuboff, who coined the phrase surveillance capitalism, is that the algorithms that technology companies use are now so sophisticated that they know us better than we know ourselves. And that as a result of that, there are fundamental threats to human freedom and to democracy because people can be manipulated. But what I think is that that is actually wrong. And part of the reason for that is to do with my professional background. Before I was a researcher and a writer, I was a marketer. And for a time, I worked at the data company Experian. And I learned there about the technique of geodemographics, which was invented in the 1980s to enable the expansion of catalog retail. So I should probably explain for the younger members of the audience that what you can see on the screen there is a picture of what we had before we had online shopping. So if you wanted to buy some the latest electronics products, you used a catalog to browse what was available, and then you made your order. So these catalogs were expensive to print and to distribute. So it was very important for catalog retailers to only send them to the people who were most likely to make purchases. So then that raised an obvious question, which is, how do you know which people you ought to send them to? And the point of geodemographics as a strategy was really to answer that question. So it worked by putting together data from public sources like the electoral roll with consumer survey data in order that marketers could understand what people might want to buy based on the postcode that they lived in. So one way of thinking about this is the old saying that birds of a feather flock together. So it wasn't really a comprehensive database on the preferences of every person in a particular country. Instead, it was a tool that was about making probabilistic inferences about the sort of things people were more likely to want and more likely to buy. So one practical example might be child car seats. If you wanted to market child car seats, it makes much more sense for you to focus on people who live in geographic areas where housing stock is large, the distances to public transportation are significant. Those are automatically a better choice for marketing child car seats than small inner city flats where nobody would have space to park a car. And so if we fast forward to today, this method is still the way that contemporary targeting systems like Facebook ads work. So there aren't really any essential differences between geodemographics and Facebook ads. The only differences are quite superficial in that in the case of Facebook ads, it involves using profile and behavioral data rather than survey data. And perhaps more significantly, the use of machine learning technology means targeting has become more sophisticated. But it's still fundamentally a system for making educated guesses about people's consumer preferences. It's not a system for controlling behavior. So in summary, I would say that data-driven ads are not as creepy as many people think. So you might be thinking, well, that's all very well, but why should we be targeted at all, even if the techniques that are being used originated in the 1980s. And there's a few different answers to this question. The first of the answers relates to what you can see on the screen here, which is Wanamaker's paradox, something that marketers are very fond of quoting. So John Wanamaker said, "Half the money I spend on advertising is wasted. The trouble is, I don't know which half." So in the context of marketing, what data does is make marketers more effective, both at targeting, but also at measuring the impactfulness of their advertising. And the result of that is that organizations can allocate capital more effectively, which has benefits for the economy and then ultimately for society. Another really important thing about data and targeting in the context of marketing is that it makes all sorts of businesses viable and scalable that wouldn't exist if the only ways of promoting products was TV advertising or press advertising and so on. So it moves us away from a world that is dominated by large players who have massive economies of scale and towards a world of what Chris Anderson called the long tail. So the implication of this for us as individual consumers is that we get to find out about products and services and causes that we never would have known about otherwise. So to bring that to life, here are just a couple of examples. All of these are businesses which depend very heavily on targeted advertising to be feasible. So one is a business called Sarah's Pet Portraits. If you send Sarah a photograph of your horse or a different kind of pet, she will produce a painting or a drawing of it. She's able to do that because she can promote her products and services specifically to people who have those types of pets. In the bottom right-hand side there, you've got Morph Suits. This is now, I think, the world's leading fancy dress apparel retailer. And they were able to become successful by specifically targeting men who looks like they were about to go on stag do's or bachelor parties. And in the top right-hand corner, this was actually prompted by a recent conversation I had with a friend who is very motivated, as I guess we all should be, by trying to reduce his plastic consumption. And so he'd been Googling ways in which he could do that. And later on Facebook, this product presented itself to him in his Facebook feed as a solution. So these are plastic-free sponges from a company called EcoVibe. Without the targeting capability brought about by data and digital technology, he probably wouldn't have found out about those products. So then another thing that I think is sometimes gets lost in this discussion is what the alternatives to the data-driven targeting of advertising might be. And the most obvious of those would be untargeted advertising. But I think a downside with that would be that our everyday experience of the internet would be a little bit degraded. So what you've got on the screen now is a screenshot from my Facebook feed that is an advertisement for the chili beef loaded fries box that was available at that time at BP petrol stations. So I don't eat meat and I don't have a car. So this was completely irrelevant to me. And I think if all advertising on the web was predicated on that type of untargeted approach, we would probably see a race to the bottom, and we would probably see our social media feeds and other media inventory on the web fill up with advertisements for hookup apps and online gambling websites and high interest loans, which might not be a thing that many of us would welcome. But just finally, when it comes to the use of data and in targeting, there's another really important consequence. And I think it's important to think about this because other people will suggest that a good solution to some of the problems that we see with digital life is that targeted advertising-based business models should be banned altogether, and we should just pay cash to use digital services like social media and search. But when you think through that idea, it actually highlights one of the hidden benefits of targeted ads as a business model for the internet. So on the screen there, you've got an analysis from my book, Good Data, of Facebook's annual results from 2018. split by the different regions of the world that Facebook operates in. And it's important to remember, I think, that subject to having a device and having connectivity to the internet, all of Facebook's billions of users around the world get access to the same set of free services. But at the same time, there are huge differences in the revenue that Facebook derives from their attention and their clicks, depending on where in the world they are. So the effect is that if you're a Facebook user in North America, your attention and your clicks are worth about $111 a year to Facebook. If you're in the rest of the world region, which includes places like Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, your attention and clicks is only worth $7.45. But everybody gets access to the same set of services. So effectively what is going on is that Facebook is, in some sense, redistributing value from more affluent users in North America and Europe to less affluent users elsewhere in the world. And the scale of that effect is actually quite significant. So it comes to around $25 billion a year. So another quite surprising thing about the use of data and digital technology for targeting that I think should give us cause for optimism about the role of this business model in our digital lives. So that was the first of my contrarian propositions. And the second is perhaps even more challenging. So it is that I think we should put more data rather than less data into the public domain. So I want to try and bring that to life by talking about a specific category of data, which I'm particularly passionate about, and that is search data. So that's the data that is created when we use Google and Bing and other search engines. And the data scientist Seth Stevens-Davidovitz has actually called this the most important data set ever collected on the human psyche. And I certainly agree with him that it provides an absolutely fascinating window onto the collective consciousness of humanity. So I'm not going to read out the examples of the most popular searches on Google that begin "I've just had." You can see those on the screen. But if you take a quick look at those, I imagine that you'll be inclined to agree with Answer the Public Sophie Coley, who says that every day we tell Google things we might not tell our partners, our friends, our family, or even our doctor. So what role does this data play in digital life today? Well, for the most part, it plays a role in the commercial world. So back when I was working at Experian, we had a partnership with a data science company called Chiasm. And they in turn had as a client Screwfix, which is a major retailer of DIY and home improvement products. And Screwfix wanted to work with some Experian search data using the skills of Chiasm to understand the differences between their own mental models for the products that they stocked and how their customers thought about those products. So there are just three examples of those on the screen. In the top left, you've got a lighting product that you might install in your garden or on the front of your property. And the product illuminates when somebody or something triggers the infrared sensor. So personally, I would call that a security light. And actually, the search data demonstrated that the vast majority of other people in Screwfix's target market also called it a security light. But to Screwfix, it was an outdoor light. At the bottom in the middle, that yellow product that looks a bit like a drill, that's a product that you can use to fire nails into a wall or into some timber. Screwfix called that product a nailer. But when they looked at the search data, it became clear that many, many times more people referred to that product as a nail gun. And then on the top right, you've got a light fitting product with some spotlight bulbs in it that you can turn and point into different corners of a room. That is in the UK anyway, is a particularly popular product for people to install in their kitchens. And the search data demonstrates that an awful lot of people, when they search for lighting online, they will search for lighting by room type. So they will Google things like kitchen lighting. But as far as Screwfix had been concerned, lights are agnostic. They don't mind which room in the house they live in. So they hadn't bothered to list any of their lighting by room type at all. So what did they do when this project was complete with all the data? Well, they tried to close the gaps between the way that they were describing their products and the way that customers were searching for them. And the result of that was that they literally generated 10 times the volume of online sales for the products that fitted into that category. So this is probably going back about 10 years. I was very excited by this story, and when I started thinking about leaving Experian to join a fintech startup called ManyPets, I wondered if I could recreate this approach in the market that we were going to focus on, which was the insurance market. And so once I had started in my role as Chief Marketing Officer at ManyPets, I engaged the data science business Chiasm again, and together we built a database of millions of rows of aggregated and anonymized internet search data about insurance. And then we set about mining it for the single biggest opportunity in the whole database that Bought by Many could focus its insurance business on. And it turned out that in all of this enormous volume of data, the biggest single opportunity was pug insurance. So that is insurance for pug dogs. So this was pretty surprising. I think probably my colleagues were concerned that I had lost the plot when I told them the results of this analysis. But actually, when we did more research into pug insurance, we discovered that there were very good reasons for this. So pugs at the time were the most popular type of puppy in the UK. And if you wanted to buy one, it would have cost you around £5,000. And yet, at the same time, the insurance product that incumbent providers of pet insurance were offering would only pay out a maximum of £1,500. There were also some real problems with those products in that they excluded many of the health conditions like hip dysplasia and breathing problems and problems with eyelids that pug dogs are particularly prone to. So it became clear that the reason people were searching for pug insurance was because incumbent insurers weren't at all recognizing the needs that pug owners had. We were then able to repeat this approach with 70 other breeds of dog and cat, and decided off the back of this analysis that we ought to focus on pet insurance as our category of choice. And fast forward to today, Bought by Many, or as it is now called, ManyPets, is a pet insurance company that insures more than 500,000 pets in the UK, the US, and Sweden, and has recently become a fintech unicorn. So those are the commercial possibilities when it comes to using search data. But I actually think where it gets really exciting is when we move beyond the commercial sector. So there's actually in academia a discipline called infodemiology, which involves applying search data to major public health challenges. And a significant academic literature has been built up over the last 10 years, looking at challenges like Zika, Ebola, West Nile virus, also at problems to do with mental health and suicide prevention. And from the perspective of academic researchers, this data has a lot of advantages. So first of all, it's massive, literally billions of rows of data being created every day. Secondly, it's free. So free both in the sense that it doesn't cost anything to use it and it's openly available. Researchers also like it because it gets away from some of the research bias that survey methods can be prone to when one is interested in what people really think. And finally, it can also capture the perspectives of people who can't normally be reached with surveys. But also perhaps important to note that by definition, it excludes people who don't have access to the internet at all. So in the up until this point, search data has mostly been used in this context by people who haven't had much power to influence the public agenda. So this includes academic researchers and some well-meaning digital marketers like me. But during the period of the pandemic, it's really come of age. And what you can see on the screen now is a screenshot from a predictive model built by the computer scientist Bill Lampos and his team at University College London. And that model is something of a landmark in the public health authorities incorporated it into their surveillance reports, their surveillance reporting relating to COVID. And what the model does is predict new outbreaks of COVID based on Google searches for COVID symptoms. And it is so effective that it can predict new outbreaks 17 days in advance of traditional forms of public health surveillance. So another really exciting thing about it is that as new variants of COVID develop, it can help spot new symptoms. So early in the pandemic, it was the first type of analysis to reveal that the loss of smell was a COVID symptom. And then things become even more exciting when one takes that type of analysis outside of the developed world and into places where conventional forms of data are missing or unreliable. So Patrick Berlinket, who's a digital marketer from New York City, built on that finding about the loss of smell being a key COVID symptom. And he developed a map of the loss of searches for loss of smell in Tanzania in East Africa. And at the time, in May 2020, the Tanzanian government was claiming that it had beaten COVID and had stopped reporting cases because, according to the government, the pandemic was over. At the same time, John Magufuli, who was the president at that point, had denied the seriousness of COVID as a disease and ridiculed the testing efforts that other countries were making. But something about what was going on in Tanzania didn't seem quite right. So footage on social media and on the ground reports were showing that hospitals were overflowing. People were being buried at night by people dressed in military uniforms. In the capital, Dodoma, 3 Tanzanian members of parliament had suddenly died in mysterious circumstances. And what Patrick's model showed was a huge increase in searches for loss of smell all across Tanzania. So the volume of searches for loss of smell that he was picking up suggested that far from the COVID outbreak being over, in fact, there were thousands of new cases happening every week. And the dark conclusion to this story was that John Magufuli, the president, himself died later that year of COVID. So I think what this points to is that in contexts where conventional data sources aren't available, search data is capable of providing some life-saving insights. There are some other aspects to it too. So search data can be very effective at highlighting the gaps between what experts know about a disease and what ordinary people think and do. So one of the people who has done most to explore this is an infodemiologist called Nicola Bragazzi at York University in Canada. And what you can see on the screen there is a screenshot from his work using looking at search behavior during the Zika outbreak in South America in 2017. Now, at the time, you might remember a lot of the news coverage about the Zika outbreak focused on microcephaly. So this is the very distressing symptom where babies were being born with abnormally small heads. But actually other symptoms of Zika are much more common, including things like conjunctivitis. And what Bragazzi's analysis showed was that there were far fewer searches for those other symptoms, and there were also far fewer searches for the actions that people could take to limit their exposure to the virus. So that includes things like avoiding or draining areas of standing water where mosquitoes breed. So, and then I guess the final aspect of infodemiology in the context of public health that is helpful to talk about is the way in which it helps us understand where people end up after they have made popular searches. So in the context of public health, they often don't end up in the higher authority places that you would hope. So on the left-hand side there, you've got some popular searches from 2020 where people were wanting to understand things like whether coronavirus could mutate into something more deadly. And below it, you've got the places that they were ending up based on the rankings on Google. So if people made the search like that and ended up on nature.com, which is obviously a highly respected academic journal, that's not a problem at all. If they end up on theconversation.com, which is a website where academic researchers write for a general audience about their areas of expertise, that also seems fine. But actually the number one result was from livescience.com, which is a commercial publisher of science news. Now, I've got no reason to believe that Live Science has anything other than positive motives, but it does seem like a better situation to me if health authorities are able to understand what people are searching for and then write the content that is needed for them to come to the public health authorities' websites. There's a similar case on the other side of the slide from India, and these are searches that relate to mucormycosis. This is a fungal infection that's a complication of COVID that was occurring with a lot of cases in India. And again, we see a similar pattern. The CDC is obviously an authoritative source of public health information in first place, but in third place, the YouTube channel Crux, which again is a relatively unknown commercial provider of news, is probably not the optimal place for people to be ending up at when they're searching for medical information. So the positive potential here in the public sector is for health authorities, other public sector organisations to get better understanding what people are looking for when they Google things and respond directly to the questions that their citizens are asking. So I would just like to finish up with a couple of slides to hopefully give you a way to use some of this data, some of these insights in your own work. So we've just talked a lot about the public health potential of search data, but what about competitive intelligence? How can it be relative? How can it be relevant in the field that you all know so much about? I should say that this competitive intelligence, this is your area of expertise. I know much less than you do, so I won't embarrass myself by trying to make search data driven pronouncements about the future of the sector. What I would like to do though is show you two simple ways that you might use some of this data in your own work. So the first thing I thought I would do is introduce you to a tool called Google Trends. This tool is free and it's got a nice user interface, so it's very simple to use. And what you can do with Google Trends is get an understanding of more or less of public interest in more or less any topic and how that interest is changing over time. So the example on the screen is of aggregated searches for competitive intelligence worldwide over the past 5 years. And I guess one thing that we can see in it is that there are quite distinctive seasonal patterns. So the fewest searches relating to competitive intelligence happen in August and at the end of December. Perhaps that's not so surprising because I imagine, like many people, these are the times that competitive intelligence professionals like yourselves take holiday. But it's also interesting that the busiest time of the year seems to be September and October. So I guess from that now must be a particularly busy time for you all. Another great feature of Google Trends is that you can use it to understand where, from a geographic perspective, interest in a particular topic is most pronounced. So on the right-hand side there, you've got the top 5 places in the world where the highest proportion of people are searching for competitive intelligence. So it looks like there's particularly strong interest in competitive intelligence in West Africa, so in countries like Nigeria and Gabon and Burkina Faso. So I can't explain that, but I think it's quite an interesting phenomenon nevertheless. And then the second tool that I thought you might like to know about is one called answerthepublic.com. So this works in a slightly different way. It aggregates all of the Google autocomplete suggestions that cluster around a specific keyword that you might be interested in. So on the screen, you can see the top questions people are asking right now about competitive intelligence. And if we zoom in on the competitive intelligence services that start with will, we can see some intriguing questions that people have got. So, for example, some of the most popular searches are, is competitive intelligence ethical? Will business intelligence jobs be automated? Is competitive intelligence espionage? So some of these are even kind of sound like existential concerns about the future of the field. But I guess the important takeaway is that by looking at this data, you can get a richer understanding of the needs that people have, whether those people are clients, whether they're people considering competitive intelligence as a career, or whether they're your fellow professionals. And perhaps you'll also be able to identify some gaps in information provision, as we saw some of the public health researchers had, respond to those and bring people to engage with what you're doing in that way. So in my working life, both in corporate life and then later as an entrepreneur, and now as a researcher, I found search data to be a constant source of insight and inspiration, and I very much hope you will too. And with that, I will say thank you and turn it over to Andrew in case there are any questions.
No, thank you very much indeed, Sam, for that address. Certainly, the chat has been live and fiery relative to framing new perspectives on good data. Right? I mean, I live in a industry who is about creating a trusted experience through services with people's digital lives, and everybody online think that their life is very secure, but there's a multi-billion-pound industry that is illegal, that is hacking, it is identity theft, it is social security number. And I come from a world half empty, right? In that regard, we do believe that the world is needing to create those tools and those approaches and experiences in a more trusted fashion. So yeah, you did reset some of that sort of dynamic towards it is not a bad place, and the experiences that people do have online do outweigh the risks of what is being either farmed or collected or created in an anonymous way. There are a couple of questions that came through, certainly around your demonstration of what can be used out of Google Trends, and that is Richard asks, is there a difference in the data using different search engines other than Google, do you think? Or is that just a matter that the other search engines aren't as popular and therefore there isn't so much of an incentive for big tech organizations behind those search engines to invest in using that data in a good way, which is where you started from, Sam?
Yes, so I think this is quite an important question, because we've probably all become too used to a world when it comes to search that is dominated by Google. So it does tend to get I think it's still close to 90% of the total global search volume. I guess as a function of that, a lot of the tools and the data sets that are available relate to Google data. So for people like the creators of answerthepublic.com, it makes a lot more sense for them to aggregate searches from Google rather than from Bing or from a different search engine. Simply on the basis that that's where most of the volume is. I mean, it's possible that things will change a little bit. So as with so many things, and August mentioned this in his introduction, COVID has provided a bit of a reset and has provided some opportunities for things to be different. And one of the things that really struck me was that Bing were much more on the front foot when it came to releasing search data about COVID searches than Google were. And that was obviously, in some respects, an altruistic thing for them to do, but also a very smart move commercially, I think, because it meant a lot of people like me, a lot of other academic researchers who are interested in search data, all of a sudden engaged with Bing data rather than with just with the normal default, which would be to use Google Trends. So perhaps that's the sign of things to come, and perhaps what we will see is Bing trying to compete a little bit with Google in terms of the data it's making available.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. In effect, it's crowdsourcing at scale, right? It's easier to flow with somebody's existing behavior than to try and change it for an alternative outcome. Welcome back, Andrea. Andrea was with us last year, so good to see you again this year, my friend. Yeah, you talk about or have made a point about the combination of government and private sector coming together to drive innovation. What are your thoughts around putting private sector organizations together with authoritative medical science organizations to better leverage data for content creation? What do you think stops what should be a natural partnership taking place, whether that's private with public or private with government? I recognize certainly here in the UK, you mentioned the phrase national identity scheme in the government sort of vernacular, and for a lot of people, they're either throwing up their lunch in their mouth or running to the hills, right? It's just generally not deemed to be a successful outcome. So what are your thoughts on innovation being created faster and for better outcomes through that partnership?
This is a fascinating question, and just to sort of add some context to my own perspective on it, for the last couple of years I've lived in Denmark, and Denmark is highly digital in government as in other things, and it's also a place where private sector providers build and operate a lot of really important bits of digital infrastructure. So if you live in Denmark, you've got a thing called NemID or MitID, which is a single credential that you use to access any online service that requires security. So all the way from booking a dentist appointment to doing your online banking, it's all the same credential. It's all operated by a private provider. So I think in a country like the UK would be unthinkable for some of the reasons you described, Andrew. And what I think this sort of boils down to is public trust. So one of the main differences between Denmark and the UK is that people in Denmark have extremely high levels of public trust in the government. So they trust that when the government is doing technology procurement, it will have the interests of the citizens it represents at heart, rather than what might happen in other contexts where people would be very concerned about straightforward forms of corruption or about relationships between people in the private sector and people in government that were otherwise seemed a bit problematic. And I mean, to come back to the question a little bit, like this is a source of regret for me, because I do think that private sector organizations, when we talk about digital technology, when we talk about data, have got a really important role to play as partners with suppliers to government. And I think it's a real shame that in the UK context, for example, there isn't more progress with things like pooling health data to enable breakthroughs in medical research, because people have got concerns about companies like Palantir, which obviously, rightly or wrongly, has a terrible reputation with the UK public, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think there is a lot more cooperation that can take place. I think societal values stop that, especially where increasingly, the world is looking for national solutions to global problems, and that only fosters probably greater sort of national solutions rather than pan-border solutions, which I get. And also the whole location of data in one place makes it a potentially an easy target, depending on how that data trove is created. And we could have a whole different summit on the whole decentralization of ID and putting control back into the hands of the consumer, for verifiable IDs. Anyway, back to the day job. So Sebastian says, you mentioned in your opening address about the distribution of wealth that Western and more advanced societies have, and their usage of Facebook, then sharing that value to other parts of the world that are perhaps not as in the same place to consume similar toys, platforms, and services. So the question is, how is that value realized for the consumer? Is it a matter of the profit that Facebook makes from one part of the world allows it to invest in another part of the world where the usage and the consumption isn't there?
Yeah, I think that's actually a very good way of putting it. So effectively what's going on is Facebook is subsidizing the provision of social media and encrypted messaging and all the other services it provides to users who are in regions that are less economically developed and where it isn't able to earn so much money in terms of advertising revenue. Probably I should have said in the presentation that I don't think Facebook, or Meta as we should probably call it now, does this out of the goodness of its heart. I think there's many other reasons behind that as a corporate strategy, but it is nevertheless an important aspect of its business model. I mean, I think the alternative that I think appeals to a lot of people who live in places like Europe and North America is the idea that we could just pay $25 a year or something and have these services and not have to be shown advertising, targeted or otherwise, the whole time. And I think for me, one of the problems with that is that if Facebook or Meta or whoever were to move to that type of model, we would see the geographic distribution of its users change to look more like something like Netflix. So Netflix varies its pricing region by region. People in Turkey pay less than people in Denmark, but nevertheless, the vast majority of Netflix's users are in the richest countries in the world. And even though they have some cheap prices in some places, there are very few people who don't get to access Netflix at all. Might not always be a bad thing. I haven't found much to watch on Netflix recently, but you get the point.
Yeah, without Netflix, we wouldn't be able to have consumed, the distrustful context that you started your presentation
right.
in through that media. But grateful. No, good question, Sebastian. Thank you for that. One person, so Adrienne, another one of our students joining us today from around the world, does utilizing a VPN network provide any actual protection for having your data sent out? Because obviously, why do people use VPNs? To create a safe tunnel to engage with the internet, and obviously, secondly, to prevent people from understanding what you're doing. Do you think that has a predominant impact on good data? Do you think?
Yeah. So I mean, this is also just a fascinating question that raises something about the way in which data like search data and other forms of behavioral data are collected in order that they can be used for analysis. So obviously we have seen in recent years some controversies with antivirus providers sharing anonymized data from their users with companies that productize or otherwise monetize that data. Now, like cards on the table, I should say that I think it is in the general interests of society that type of activity happens, because I think it's helpful for the reasons I've laid out, that data is out in the world. At the same time, I do very much believe that people who want to control the way in which data about them flows out into the internet. So they have every right to do that. And it's incumbent upon all organizations that deal with data to make it clear and transparent, the way in which they can exercise that type of control.
Yeah, no, brilliant. Thank you for that. Last two questions, if we can fit them in before the time is up. Search data. So this comes from Nana. Thank you for joining us, Nana. Search data may be fraught with fake data in order to, pursue a certain narrative. What are your thoughts about this potential? Basically, changing the contents of the apple barrel to, create a different outcome. It's anti, your good data, and fake news, fake data going into that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a little hard to comment because the process by which the data is collected by Google and Bing is completely opaque. I'd be surprised if there is a lot of bot-driven search, for example, that is polluting the data set, and that the data scientists at Google and Microsoft and other search engines just haven't noticed. But I can't give a definitive answer, I'm afraid.
Yeah. And the last question from Cynthia, one of our CR fellows. Good to join us, Cynthia. How do you stay on top of all of this change in tech and digital and its impacts? How are you sort of putting your mental map down to try and make sense of all of this?
Yeah, so I'm hugely sympathetic to this question because it is it's quite overwhelming. Like there is a lot of things to try and keep up with, and I think I've probably developed two techniques. So one is I use Twitter a lot to keep up with particularly people who are thoughtful voices in the debate about data and technology. That has some other downsides in terms of getting distracted by cat videos and so on. Another service that I can really strongly recommend if you want to keep up with the latest academic literature and other sorts of thinking, like sort of serious critical thinking about these topics, is a service called The Syllabus. So that is curated by Evgeny Morozov, who's a very well-known tech writer, and that sends you an email every week with 15 or so most important things that you should read or listen to. So that's probably even better.
Brilliant. Sam, you've been an eye-opener, a great keynote address, throws open a whole range of issues that we will explore over the next 2 days. Thank you very much indeed on behalf of everyone who's joined us, our sponsors. Thank you very much indeed, Sam, and thank you for joining us from Denmark.
That's my pleasure. I wish you all the best for the rest of the summit.
We hope you enjoyed this session replay from the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows 2022 Summit, Foresight Now, Harness the Future. We also hope that you'll join us for future educational programming that advances the field of competitive intelligence and adjacent fields. If you'd like more information about future events, the fellows, or our competitive intelligence community of practice, please visit the link in our Vimeo profile. Thank you so much.